I'm Alex.
And I'm Eddie.
Welcome to the 17th episode of Catch 52, a politics podcast brought to you by WDSR Duquesne Student Radio.
We are now 35 weeks away from Inauguration Day 2021.
And we're getting back to normal. There's a lot of weird stuff that's happened this week. There's an important case study, at least that I think we should be looking at. Trump has tweeted some interesting things that are worth talking about. Are they legal? Are they crazy? Is it both? Who knows?
All right, so let's start off with that special election that just happened on the 12th of May in California's 25th congressional district.
Right. So on that day, Democrat Christy Smith conceded defeat to now Republican representative of the 25th District of California, Mike Garcia. And this is the first time the Republicans have won a seat in a California House seat since 1998, or the first time they have picked up a seat since 1998. Sorry. It was about 55-45 as far when the votes were all totaled. So a pretty solid win for Representative Mike Garcia. But as I mentioned earlier, this is the first time in 20 years that the Republicans have flipped a district in California. So what does this mean?
So Alex thinks this is a pretty big deal. I really don't. So here's my reasoning first. So California 25, since 1992, after the 1990 census, it was redistricted. Ever since then, it has been a Republican seat. It was a Republican seat through Clinton, through Bush, through Obama. And then during the 2018 election, for the first time in 25 years, it flipped over back, or 20 years, it flipped back to red, and it flipped to blue. So 25 years, one Democrat won. A year and a half later, that Democrat lost a new Democrat lost after a Democrat resigned due to a scandal. Typically, parties involved in scandals don't do too well. See Roy Moore, see Connor Lamb. Parties who are involved in a scandal typically tend to lose that next election unless you're Chris Collins. But otherwise, that's pretty typically the trend. And in a state in a district that already has leaned red for 25 years, I don't think it's that big of a deal that it went back to where it more regularly stands.
Here's why people should be talking about this, but they're not. All right, number one, we do not have any evidence of how people are going to be voting during the pandemic. So every chance that we can get to have some kind of election to gauge what happens when we spend more money in certain areas, what happens when we spend no money when people are mailing in a majority of their ballots. So that's really helpful. For this whole time, we've only had the Wisconsin primary to go off of, and the Wisconsin primary took place literally right at what I think people perceive to be the heart or the height of the pandemic, even though that wasn't true. Republicans forced the election to go forward, and this wasn't even this was a judicial election, I believe. It was a special election, and so the Wisconsin Supreme Court forced it to go forward. So right at the last minute. So you have that kind of confounding factor, but at the same time, it's the only case study. Now we have a second, and this is a case study in which the Republican won as opposed to the Democrat. And sure, the scandal happened. That definitely also messes with things. At the same time, it's really, really interesting when you look at the kind of spending that Republican PACs and super PACs did compared to Democratic super PACs. So, for example, the DCCC spent no money on this race. Emily's List spent no money on this race. And they said that trying to do advertising in the LA market is way too expensive. Fair enough. So why did the Republicans pump $1.5 million into get out the vote efforts? Because clearly that worked. And you could say it's oh, well, they flipped the seat. So this is a swing district. So why didn't Democrats care? There's so many conflicting pieces of evidence. So on one hand, this was a blue wave district. There's there are 6% more registered Democrats than Republicans. And the former representative who resigned, I believe her name was Katie Hill, so she carried it by 9% in 2018. Hillary Clinton carried the district by 7% in 2016. So sure, not only is this a district that went blue in 2018 with the blue wave, but this is a district that went blue during the presidential election 4 years ago. So it is not like a one-off as a result of everything else happening. It was showing a trend. There's also a very, very high, there's also like an increasing rate of voter registration among Hispanics, which are becoming an increasingly important demographic for both Democrats and Republicans. And it's an example of what happens when you have a really solid candidate on the Republican side. So Mike Garcia and this is a direct quote from one of his strategists. He ran a campaign straight out of Top Gun. Every time he appeared in public, he had like planes behind him. He's a former Navy fighter pilot, and he's also a Raytheon executive in a town that Raytheon, I don't want to say basically owns, but a very, very high percentage of people work in like the defense contracting industry. So it's a candidate that vibes with the town. It's a candidate that is fit for the district. And not only that, but he's an unknown entity, and he's a very like polished speaker. He's very many things that Trump is not. Combine all of these things, and the fact that more news hasn't been covering this election, I think is bad form.
So my counterpoint is I don't think the seat flipped. I don't think the seat flipped. It was a Democratic seat for a year and a half since 1992. So for the what's that? I'm just going to do the math because it's
sure the
right?
seat flipped, but it voted for Clinton in 2017.
But it's been a Republican House seat for 28 years. For a quarter of a century, it has been a solid Republican seat. It was a Democratic seat for 18 months, and then it became a Republican seat again. I don't think that's flipping the seat. I think that's just reverting to the norm. Just because there are more Democrats in an area doesn't mean that they're going to always elect a Democrat. Mitt Romney was the governor of Massachusetts. Massachusetts regularly elects Republican governors. And that's also because Democrats can support Republican candidates, especially in a more moderate district like this one, where more moderate Republicans run. It's not as much a question of, oh, this is a sign of what's to come. It's that there was a good candidate running on the Republican side, and that there was a scandal on the Democratic Party side, so Democrats weren't too excited about getting out, just like we see in any special election. If anything, this tells us more about how to run a special election, not how to run either a pandemic election or a general election in or out of a pandemic.
Turnout still matters. We can look at turnout and we can draw conclusions. What happens when Democrats don't turn out? And the scandal is definitely a reason why turnout was down. I'll give you that. But it adds to the overwhelming narrative, which is when people don't go to the polls, Republicans tend to win. And in this case, it's no different.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that it's a different candidate. It's the scandal, it's the pandemic, it's the fact that most Hispanic Americans in that district who are voting by mail are less likely to return their mail-in ballots. So that is a concern for Democrats, especially if we're in 2020 and there are definitely some people who are fantasizing about flipping Texas, or if you're trying to say flip New Mexico, flip Arizona. We have to look at this and say, why is the Hispanic rate of returning mail-in ballots so low? Well, initially you have to say, it's like, all right, well, if English is not your first language, might not be so easy to fill out a mail-in ballot. Awesome. How did Democrats fix that? And how do we look at the Republican efforts to sort of keep that process going? Because that's lost in all of this, that to fill out a mail-in ballot, you have to be able to read English almost fluently. And that is something that is important for Democrats going into this election season.
So again, I don't think that this really proves the point of Democratic turnout. That's a pretty well-known fact that lower turnouts are good for Republicans. Again, I don't think that really shows anything. But what you can see is that even in that 2018 election where Kate Hill won, she won by 9.5%, which is pretty good. But in the primary, the Republican got a majority of the votes. And the way primaries work in California is all candidates, regardless of party, are on the ballot. and on the same ballot, which means that state even then was not a solid Democratic state or a solid Democratic district when they won. They squeaked out a victory because in the primary, the Republican didn't even have the plurality; they had the majority. They had 51.8% of the vote. And then in this election, the Republican won in an election with about 100,000 fewer voters. They won by the same exact voter margin, not percentage margin, as Kate Hill had won by. So about by 20,000 votes, Kate Hill won in 2018. Mike Garcia won by 20,000 votes in 2020. I don't think that that's just because of a pandemic. I don't think that's just because of a candidate. I think it's mostly because that there was a scandal. The Democrats didn't want to turn out, and that's why 50,000 fewer Democrats turned out this election.
At the same time, 538 and Cook both have this seat in the fall as likely or lean Democrat.
It all depends on
It all depends.
Up and down ballot elections.
And it's the same two candidates running again. It's Christy Smith and Mike Garcia who are running again. So
we'll see what happens with the pandemic. We'll see what happens with Trump Biden. We'll see what happens with advertising there. But again, I don't think it's that big of a deal that a 28-year long Democrat or Republican seat went back to a Republican after a wait year. Regardless, next point is that whole election doesn't matter because it's corrupt anyway, according to President Trump.
Yeah, because I guess we didn't know this before, but mail-in ballots are they're illegal. They are no, they're not illegal. He didn't say that. But there's a high likelihood for fraud.
Yeah, they're corrupt and they're fraudulent. So he went on a nice little tweeting spree. So we're going to read some Trump tweets.
First things, right, why are we covering a presidential? Why are we covering Trump's tweets? We try to avoid it. Why are we doing it now? Because, like, okay, let's if this gets turned into a clip, which it definitely will. There's probably going to be a lot of hate for this. Honestly, this is probably an impeachable offense. What just happened? No, seriously,
that's an impeachable offense, and I don't think that this is going to be one. No.
He won't get impeached for this. The House won't even consider it, and they shouldn't. But out of equilibrium, if you try and use the government's power to influence elections, and in a specifically partisan way like this, that's like impeachable.
So as we've said earlier, high turnout leads to better performances for Democrats, typically. Not in every case, but typically. There are, obviously in high Republican districts and high Republican states, high turnout is better for Republicans. But in most moderate states, Republicans vote at a higher percentage than Democrats do, which means when more people vote, the tides just kind of balance out a little bit more. So you generally get a more equal turnout among Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, whereas typically you see Republicans vote more than anyone else, and then Independents, and then Democrats, I believe is
that's it. Because old people vote.
Yeah.
That's what they do.
These tweets go as following. So first, Michigan. He says, Michigan sends absentee ballot applications to 7.7 million people ahead of primaries in the general election. This was done illegally and without authorization by a rogue Secretary of State. I will ask to hold up funding to Michigan if they want to go down this voter fraud path. Voter fraud, of course, meaning mail-in ballots.
So here's the thing about what the Secretary of State was doing in Michigan. Sending out let me get this right. So she wasn't sending out absentee ballots. No, absentee ballot applications. And guess what? Plenty of Republican secretaries of states are doing exactly the same thing. Because guess what? It increases turnout, and it's not forcing you to vote. It's not saying, do this, vote. It has nothing to do with violating your free speech or any kind of stuff like that. It's just saying, hey, we're making it easier for you to apply to vote in a more safe way.
It's already not hard to apply for absentee ballots. You can already do it online. This is just giving people a paper reminder, hey, you can vote. It's not hard to vote. Here's your opportunity to vote. So to call it voter fraud, to call it illegal, that's not really true. I can't speak to whether or not it was authorized properly. but that's something that is more Michigan state law than U.S. constitutional law. And I think I, alongside President Trump, are not experts on Michigan state law. Um, so I can't really say whether or not that was, what the authorization process was. But I seriously don't think mailing applications to people for them to vote is that bad of a deal. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone that really, really thinks that this was an awful thing to do, other than maybe very extreme environmentalists for the 7.7 million pieces of paper being mailed out. But like, it's really not that big of a deal. But also, he tweeted about Nevada. So he says the state of Nevada, quote unquote, thinks that they can send out illegal vote by mail ballots, creating a great voter fraud scenario for the state and the US. They can't. If they do, quote unquote, I think I can hold up funds to the state. Sorry, but you must not cheat in elections. At RussVought45, who is the director of the Office of Bureau and what is it, OBM?
Office of Management and Budget.
Yeah, Office of Budget and Management, and then also at U.S. Treasury.
Okay, this is what I'm saying when it's like this. I think is an impeachable offense, and I don't really think it's that much of a stretch. I'm not saying that the Democrats should do it. I'm not saying people should be calling for it. But if we take this incident in a vacuum of nothing else has happened, we have this president and he just tweeted this thing. We've already seen there's already legal precedent for what happens on Twitter being bound by constitutional law. Like lawmakers, I believe, are not allowed to block certain people on Twitter because that's limiting their free speech. So Twitter is not absolved of any kind of like legal restrictions or anything like that. So that's point number one. Point number two. What happens when the president uses the powers of the executive branch to influence elections in the favor of his party? That's all I'm saying. Yeah. And it's not like he just, and I get it. It's Trump. He's trolling. He's doing all this stuff. And that's why nothing's going to happen. And that's why nothing should happen, because most people understand Trump on Twitter to just be spouting off and nothing really comes of it.
Just think about if Obama had tweeted this out, what the Republican reaction would be if Obama said, I'm withholding federal funds because I think that this thing that this governor did was wrong.
Just imagine if Trump had communicated it in a slightly different way, right? He tagged Steve Mnuchin, Secretary of the Treasury, or the Treasury Twitter account.
Yeah.
And he tagged Russ Vaught, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Management and Budget. Good grief. The two people who the president would need to send a letter to in order to make this kind of thing happen, in order to withhold federal funds. Imagine if, rather than tweeting it out, he had done it by sending a letter, sending a memo to those people and say, hey, withhold funds from these two states until they cancel their absentee ballot programs. And like, imagine that letter had then gotten like leaked or something like that. It would be insane because it's such a blatant example. But because it's happening on Twitter, nobody gives it a second thought.
Yeah, another just fun fact is that Russ Vought is also not the director of the Office of Management and Budget. He is the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget because he has yet to be confirmed by Congress.
I keep forgetting that we don't have any like executive or like agency directors that are not acting anymore.
There are very few. It's basically just the main cabinet that's actually confirmed, and then everyone else is just acting. But that's how the cookie crumbles these days. But following those up, he retweeted a tweet from probably the best journalist in the U.S. History, Charlie Kirk, founder of Turning Point USA, which is incredibly reputable. Never been called out for being partisan. Never been called out for being any sort of bias. They've done a great job of just presenting the facts. But anyways, they said, retweet if President Trump should withhold federal funds to states that try to steal our elections with voter fraud. Steal being all caps.
First of all, how does a state steal an election? By withholding federal funds?
With voter fraud. So he's saying that by sending mail-in ballots, it is voter fraud that helps states steal elections?
So by encouraging people to vote, by potentially increasing the amount of people who are using their constitutional right to speak up on behalf of what change they want to see in this country, by
Yeah.
encouraging people to speak up, states are stealing elections.
So it's kind of a pretty thinly veiled attempt to, again, as we were saying, just make sure the voter turnout is not higher so Democrats don't do as well. Um, and I say thinly veiled because the more you know that Republicans don't want as much voter turnout, you can see how hard they try to not have as much voter turnout. Things like voter ID laws ideally would be great, but then if you say, okay, let's have voter ID laws and let's mail them out alongside social security cards and make sure everyone's automatically registered and given a voter ID card,
We can't do that. No.
we couldn't do that. Even though,
There'd be fraud.
even though we already have a list of every at least male that's 18 years old because we have selective service. And I didn't sign up for that. They just mailed me the thing that says, hey, you're 18, sign up. So I think they could do that for pretty much anyone. I think you could double that size of the program, give everyone a voter ID and register them to vote. But once you say that, they're like, oh, no, that's probably unconstitutional. But again, talking about this thinly veiled attempt, Trump in a recent press conference had these quotes. So a reporter asked him, so you said you think mail voting is corrupt, but you also voted by mail in 2018, correct? And he said, quote, mail voting is corrupt. Sure, I can vote by mail because I'm allowed to. That's called out of state. You know why I voted? Because I happen to be in the White House and won't be able to go to Florida to vote. Another fun fact, just before we get into that, Trump has never actually permanently resided in Florida. He's just had residences in Florida. But because his main residence has always been in New York City, a solid blue district and a solid blue state, there's no need for him to vote in New York, but his vote actually matters in Florida. So if you're wondering why he's voting in Florida and not, DC where he's currently living or New York where he always lives, it's because his vote matters more in Florida.
Okay,
but
just let's get into this a little bit. Because I can vote by mail because I'm allowed to. Okay, yes. So awesome. There are, who else votes by mail? The military, the State Department, anybody who is working in an embassy across the world. So they all vote by mail. Who else votes by mail?
College students, typically.
College students.
Yeah, anyone living out of their home state votes by mail. And typically in a pandemic, you would want people to stay at home, not go outside, not interact with many people. So the way to do that is voting by mail. So how exactly is voting by mail corrupt? Well, again, they pressed him on that, and he said, you get thousands and thousands of people sitting in somebody's living room, signing ballots all over the place.
So it's they have this thing, one ballot per person. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a funny feeling that the president in his mind's eye is imagining like one of those really kind of uplifting pictures from like Get Out the Vote events where it's not about like politics or anything. It's just about like, we're here to help you register to vote, right? And usually you see like a disproportionately high percentage of minorities because usually they're the people who are not registered to vote or are unsure of the right way to go about doing it. So that kind of imagery I feel like is very easily conjured. And so, if you've got black and brown people voting, they're probably doing it illegally. I don't know. I don't know what to deal with it. I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know what to say about it because it's one of these things that we just constantly say, this is a thing that got said. And then we like throw it over our shoulder and forget about it for the rest of time because individually it matters. But when you're stepping on a bed of nails rather than just one nail, you don't feel any of them.
Yeah. So he ended up saying basically what he believes happens is they go to the registrar's office, I guess, pick up thousands of ballots. He said like they take thousands of ballots, go back home, fill them out with like thousands of people, and you get thousands of people submitting thousands of votes. Now, obviously, you would see voter turnout increases of thousands of times. They also, in a state, let's say a district of, 200,000 people, they wouldn't have many more than like maybe 250,000 ballots. So you'd be able to see pretty clearly voter fraud, especially if you're doing it by the thousands, as he's accusing. And also, it's very easy to apply for an absentee ballot. I don't think it's very easy to steal an absentee ballot because, especially, I know at least in Virginia, when you do, it comes with your name signed on it and your voter
Yes.
ID number on it. And so I assume that's put into a database somewhere, so they make sure you cannot vote multiple times.
Usually people don't look at pieces of paper and then toss them into the metaphorical ballot box or the real ballot box. I don't know how they do it.
Yeah.
I feel like there is a process of gathering all this information in order to check for voter fraud, because
Yeah.
if there wasn't some kind of law or code saying we need this information in order to prevent fraud, why would they ask for it?
Yeah.
Just
He
to
also
have
said
it?
But he also said that Florida is okay with out-of-state voting because they have a certification method. Um, but the thing is, every state has certification method. It's called voter ID numbers, and it's called having a witness on to sign that envelope for you. Those are the only ways you can have certification methods in a mail-in ballot.
I mean, if we're willing to call into question the entire system of like having witnesses sign for you on things, sure, fair enough. I feel like the existing legal system and the punishments for fraud are pretty strong deterrents. But hey, I mean, if that's the kind of reform you're looking for, you do you. But again, I don't think that's what
Yeah, it's
I don't
also
think that's what
important
this
to
is about.
mention that most instances of voter fraud in the past at least decade have been from Republicans. I believe there was an arrest
There's
last
been
year
very
from a
few
man
though.
in, no, it's been very few, obviously, like under 1,000. But there was an arrest from a man in North Carolina in 2019 that tried to do this and tried to stuff ballots, but he got discovered because his name was there a ton and he got arrested
We would be
for
remiss to ignore what's currently on the top of Trump's Twitter account, which is a Breitbart News article. We have not looked into it terribly, so take it with a grain of salt. However, according to that article, a Pennsylvania elections judge pleaded guilty to stuffing ballot boxes in 2014, 2015, 2016, and was paid by a Democratic political consultant. That's, again, I have not read the case. That's just what Breitbart has reported.
So
It's
also,
definitely not just Republicans. It's not just Democrats. The point is, it doesn't really matter who it is because it like never happens. And if it does, it's so rare.
it's also important to mention that the Democrats did not do very well in 2014, 15, or 16 in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's right.
So, anyways, next on his Twitter list is his, as I call it, not so hot take on the Democratic primaries, which is apparently still a very important issue going on. It's a close race right now between Biden. So here is his take. It's two tweets. Crazy Bernie Sanders is not a fighter. He gives up too easy. The Dem establishment gets Alfred E. Newman, Mayor Pete, and at Amy Klobuchar to quit and endorse Sleepy Joe before Super Tuesday and gets Pocahontas to stay in the race, taking thousands of votes from Bernie. He would have beaten Sleepy Joe in a landslide.
A landslide.
Every state if these events didn't happen. Even if Warren just dropped out, he would have easily won. Dems did it to him with crooked Hillary, and now even more so. And Bernie doesn't even complain. Vote for Trump on trade, better than Bernie Sanders. Now,
Bernie doesn't even complain. What a nice guy.
real quick. So let's just take the Warren thing, because obviously we can't say what would have happened if Pete and Klobuchar had stayed, and that would
Yes,
take
this
a
is where I
couple
wanted to start as
hours
well.
of analysis of polls moving. But if Warren had dropped out, Bernie would have won Massachusetts and Minnesota. And then Oklahoma would have been a toss-up. Warren typically polled about 10% in most states. Biden generally won by about 15 to 20% in every state.
Yes. At the same time, the other thing you have to consider is I think that the percentage of Warren supporters who had Bernie as their number two is consistently overestimated.
Yeah, so the thing with Warren supporters is there's a reason that they were Warren supporters and not Bernie supporters, because they're so similar that if you support Warren over Bernie, there's generally a pretty strong reason. Bernie was the front runner, or one of the two front runners at least for those past couple months leading up to Super Tuesday and right before Super Tuesday. So if you really cared about just having a progressive candidate elected, you would have been supporting Bernie over Warren. meaning Warren supporters saw a difference between those two candidates. So it's not a guarantee that 100% of Warren voters would have moved over to Bernie, even if even a majority or a plurality would have.
There were a few quick polls of Warren supporters done in like the millisecond in which she was like the lightning rod candidate, and I have and a statistically significant percentage of them went to Biden. I think it may have even been a majority.
I know it was at least 25%. So let's say
I'm pretty sure it was in like the mid to high 30s.
I remember polls from like early in like January and February saying about 25%, but that can obviously change because that was after Warren had kind of dimmed back down.
Exactly, and it was such a situational thing. That's beside the point. So he goes on to talk about okay, we've got God, there's so many pieces. I get distracted by the Alfred E. Newman thing because I don't know, maybe that's a generational thing.
So Alfred E. Newman was the little boy on the cover of Mad magazine, which is again itself a very dated reference. It was like a satirical magazine back in the day. You'd be very hard pressed to find many young people. By young, I mean like under 35
people
that know what Mad magazine is. Really just kind of Trump showing his age and his voter base that people enjoy that. But anyways.
Okay, so second part of this. You want somebody to vote. Can you pull the tweet back up? I need to. There's so many sides of this. Okay, so you want somebody to. So he finishes off by saying, and this might actually be a bit smart. Vote for Trump on trade. Better than Bernie Sanders. So the whole point of this tweet, if we just take the beginning and we take the end and we cut out all of the stuff and the name calling, crazy Bernie Sanders is not a fighter. He gives up too easy. Cut the rest of it. Vote Trump on trade. Better than Bernie Sanders. Number one, it's a really, really interesting way to try and convert Bernie Sanders supporters, but I do understand the push. You know, there's some Bernie Sanders supporters who are so annoyed with the DNC for rigging it.
Although I don't think that many Bernie Sanders supporters are single issue voters on especially on trade, where Bernie's not in the majority of Democrats.
Anybody who was a Sanders supporter who is voting on trade is also voting on other things. That's literally like the uneducated or the poorly educated, like white rural suburban voter. That's who that is.
Yeah,
it's people working in factories. It's people working in odd jobs, sometimes trades. Those kind of people who are. That's the voter base.
And real quick, let's just say uneducated doesn't mean stupid. Uneducated just means doesn't have a college education.
Yeah.
Get that up there.
Non-college educated whites. Yes. That's the phrase.
Yes.
Some of those people vote on trade. Some of them. But it's difficult to prove to say that they were drawn to Bernie Sanders because of his stance on trade. I feel like they're drawn to Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders, like Trump, is very outspoken, is rebelling against the establishment. Has the same kind of like, I don't know, he has the same kind of aura, the same kind of vibe that Trump has a little bit. But I don't know how much the actual like status of the issues matters. And Bernie Sanders' reputation consistently has been that he is tough on trade.
So both of them are trade protectionists generally. And that's what typically can gain at least a little bit of support over another candidate from like factory workers and people in like the industrial Midwest, particularly. That's a large reason why Trump won a lot of industrial Midwestern voters in 2016, because Hillary was seen as a very globalist free trade candidate, whereas Trump was not, which is fair. But like that's not the main reason people support Bernie Sanders. It might be a differentiating factor, but it's not necessarily a main support. If someone listening, it was a Bernie supporter on trade, please tell us. We'd love to talk to you about that. But yeah, the thing is, if you take out those first and second sentences,
Yes.
or those first and last sentences, you get a much different type of tweet, which is the Democratic establishment gets Mayor Pete and Amy Klobuchar to quit and endorse Sleepy Joe before Super Tuesday and gets Pocahontas to stay in the race, taking thousands of votes from Bernie. He would have beaten Sloppy Joe in a landslide every state if these events didn't happen. If Warren just dropped out, he would have easily won. Dems did it to him with crooked Hillary, and now even more so, Bernie didn't even complain. That's
Sloppy Joe Biden.
sorry, Sleepy Joe Biden. My bad. That's all. I mean, in terms of actually good nicknames, Sloppy Joe Biden would be a much better nickname considering how much Trump likes to make fun of Joe Biden's gaffes. But
Yeah, okay. Sleepy
regardless,
Joe. Well, they're also going with Beijing Biden.
yeah, Beijing Biden, because he stood next to the Asian U.S. Was it Secretary of Commerce under Obama, I believe, and
Assistant Secretary, something like that.
yeah, assistant. So like an Obama cabinet official who happened to be Asian and was speaking at an Asian or a Chinese American event with Joe Biden. So, you know, you see an Asian man standing at a podium with a US and Chinese flag behind him, and Joe Biden like shakes his hand. They're like, does Joe Biden work? Like, is Joe Biden in China's pocket? Um, but it's just like it's an attack. It's not that hot of a take, and it's not that true of a take. It like Mayor Pete is pretty irrelevant right now.
Yeah.
Same with Elizabeth Warren. Neither of them are you know, Warren's not really in the vice presidential race. She kind of is, but like not really.
She's only on the race according to the Vegas odds.
Yeah.
But according to
Uh,
the Vegas odds, so are Hillary and Michelle Obama. So
so is Andrew Cuomo, which is who is not a woman to the best of my knowledge.
imagine.
So yeah, it's not a very hot take. It's not a very good take. It's a confusing tweet all around why he would get into that. But it goes on his thread of attacking Democrats because he also is now bringing up Obamagate again.
You say Obamagate like it's a real thing. Well, I
Yeah,
guess
so
it is now.
so Obamagate first was Obama tapping the lines of the Trump campaign office allegedly during the election, which there was never actually any proof of. But now he's saying that there's Obamagate, and that Joe Biden's involved with Obamagate, and he's sending out tons of emails saying Joe Biden's involved with Obamagate. And so they're asking, so what is Obamagate? And he responded, it's been going on for a long time. It's been going on from before I even got elected, and it's a disgrace that it happened. And so they again said, what is it? And he said, you know what the crime is. The crime is very obvious to everybody. All you have to do is read the newspapers except yours. I believe that was mentioning
Awesome.
Washington Post. But
all right, so what is Obamagate? Okay, it's so convoluted, but I guess to a liberal like me, I would never understand. Best I can understand, as you said, it starts with the wiretapping of Michael Flynn.
Yeah.
Or not the wiretapping of Michael Flynn.
So the wiretapping.
See, this is what happens.
Wiretapping's an old story. Wiretapping's the old Obamagate. This is new Obamagate.
See, this is what happens. I just said the wiretapping of Michael Flynn like it was a thing that happened, and I was like, wait, no, that never happened. But by just saying words and putting like slogans, turning all this stuff, creating all these slogans, creating all these terms, Obamagate. Oh man, it sounds like something's there. Wiretapping, illegal. He was out to get Trump. This kind of stuff, and you just start saying, and you get lost in it. So Michael Flynn was never wiretapped. I believe it had something to do with people calling for Michael Flynn's unmasking in top secret documents.
So there was a leak that said apparently Michael Flynn was pressured to plead guilty and was actually innocent the whole time. But what also came, because this was a part of a bunch of documents that Michael Flynn's lawyers used.
Michael Flynn may have been pressured to plead guilty by his own lawyers.
Yeah. But so a bunch of those documents were released, and among those documents were FBI files that had been received by the Flynn camp or Flynn's lawyers, and it basically said that the FBI under the Obama administration had begun investigating whether or not there were ties into Trump and Russia, because there were many concerns that there were ties between Trump and Russia back then, like Trump saying Putin I don't know if you hear me, but if so, maybe we can get a hold of Hillary Clinton's emails.
So I feel like the FBI investigating
Yeah.
potential activity that could, make the election illegitimate, anything to interfere with the election. That seems like the FBI's job.
Yeah.
And when it has to do with investigating your party, what may seem like a coordinated attack is more of a coordinated execution of the law.
Yeah.
And that seems lost on the whole situation.
So Trump's been trying to get Bill Barr to investigate Obama and especially Biden on this whole thing. The problem is Trump kind of shot himself in his foot by by appointing Bill Barr as his Justice Department head, because Bill Barr believes in this little thing called the Unitary Executive Theory.
Hey, if you've seen the movie Vice, leave a comment, because this is where the Unitary Executive Theory is sort of like showcased in a more cinematic
also,
form.
It's
brilliant.
If you've read anything in constitutional law, Unitary Executive Theory pretty much says, well, it says the president it says the executive powers are vested in the president. So they're like, oh, well, then the president has all the executive powers. That's essentially what Unitary Executive Theory is. That the president has all executive powers,
So what does that
including the power to call foreign officials to ask. So like, a lot of Republican actions have been justified under Unitary Executive Theory, including Trump's impeachment, where he said, well, this was okay, this was in my boundaries to do because I am the executive officer. Congress gave me these funds. I can distribute them as I please. So in the same way that it's withholding funds falls within Unitary Executive. That's why Trump has William Barr as his attorney general, because that's where Trump lies also, as in Unitary Executive Theory.
Very convenient tool.
But the problem is Bill Barr, because he agrees with Unitary Executive Theory, is not going to prosecute an executive for using his executive power.
Well, because the president could do anything, I guess Obama couldn't have done anything illegal. So
yeah. So like, regardless of whether or not there's any evidence, Bill Barr pretty much said, no, I'm not going to look into it, because I don't think that even if something happened that it was wrong, because he believes that the president is above the law. So it's kind of a dead horse right now, except there may or may not be a horse, and there probably is no horse, but Trump's just beating the ground and saying that there's a horse there.
Absolute executive powers, this kind despotism, if you want to call it that. That kind of power goes both ways. And so, unfortunately, when you have, a cabinet official or somebody in charge with investigating who has the trappings of legitimacy, and Bill Barr doesn't even have really much of that anymore. But if you're going to be the AG and say, all right, I am for the Unitary Executive Theory, that has to go both ways. And I guess a relative degree of consistency is something that still exists at the Justice Department. And so while we have to kind of half-heartedly applaud the Attorney General for sticking to his questionable principles, in this case, it comes off, and the media has been covering it as though William Barr is going against the president, which is hilarious, because then that means that Trump has to try and come down on probably his favorite cabinet secretary at the moment.
If someone like James Comey was the FBI director still, or was the attorney general even, he would be someone that would be more inclined to investigate it, because Comey does not believe in Unitary Executive Theory. Comey is Comey much more believes in, the executive being under the law, being just as accountable as any other U.S. citizen. So that's Obamagate. No evidence of anything happening, and nothing will be prosecuted by the U.S. government. But it is, and has been, in Trump campaign emails for about a month now, and I don't see it stopping anytime soon, even though, the crime's there. Everyone knows the crime committed. It's in every newspaper except for the Washington Post.
There's been a few people who have spoken on the record about this, or it's unlikely that it's going to come to anything. And, if it does, we will see what happens. Because if we can remember what happened in the sort of the final moments of the election 4 years ago, it seems like we're kind of building to that sort of very, very explosive, very, very destabilizing conclusion. But one last thing. It just happened literally an hour ago. And once again, take it with a grain of salt, because this reporting has not been verified by any other news. But according to CBS News, it's reported this at about 5 o'clock today, and we're recording on Thursday. CBS News reports that Amy Klobuchar was asked to undergo official vice presidential vetting by Joe Biden.
Yeah.
All right.
So
let's hear this take on Amy Klobuchar as Biden's VP.
So it was a senior Biden campaign aide. I just would like to say first that I have been not necessarily hoping, but assuming that Klobuchar was going to be a vice presidential candidate since 2016, when I saw her talk when I was a congressional intern on the Hill. I was like, yeah, she'd be a great VP. And so I don't want to say I called it, but I kind of called it. But I don't remember who I wanted her to run with, but I'll see if
Sherrod
I can find
Brown.
it. Anyways. Yes, right. I wanted a Sherrod Brown, Amy Klobuchar ticket. I think even now, I think that'd be an amazing ticket. Sherrod Brown is like the exact like rugged Ohio Democrat that the DNC could really thrive with. But he said in about a year ago, maybe even longer, that he wasn't going to be running for president. So those dreams kind of dropped. But regardless, Klobuchar as a VP, I think would be great. I think if you look back to episode 1 of our show, when we talk about pivotal voter theory, if you look at Wisconsin especially, Wisconsin's very, very similar to Minnesota, and Klobuchar bleeds Minnesota, like bleeds those Great Lake blood. she bleeds Lake Superior. And I think that's something that's really going to be a benefit to trying to win in Wisconsin and Michigan especially, and probably still in Pennsylvania, although if you look at polls, polls can change so much, but if the election was held today, Pennsylvania would be a pretty solid lock for Biden. But Biden's influence in PA, because Scranton, and then also Klobuchar's influence in Minnesota, hopefully, I think their campaign thinking is we'll basically just like slowly seep blue back into the Midwest.
Hopefully. So, if your strategy is Midwest, awesome. I am not so sold on the fact that Pennsylvania is a lock for Biden. I know that the polls say it is, but we've been down this road before. And I live here. I'm not sold yet.
Okay.
But Biden definitely stands a better chance than Hillary, easily. Here's my thing on Klobuchar. I don't want to say that the Democrats are committing the same sin that they did in 2016, where you combine 2 loaves of white bread and called it a ticket, but it is definitely leaning in that direction. It's better because Klobuchar definitely provides a boost in states that matter rather than Tim Kaine in Virginia. At the same time, Klobuchar, it depends on what you think is a better way to go about doing this, right? If you are a believer in the theory that the way to win this election is with suburban white, usually college-educated women, Klobuchar is pretty solid. But she is just solid for that specific population. But if your argument is we're going to, of the categories that need to flip Democrat, we're going to take suburban white, college-educated women, I can see that. If that's your selling point, it makes sense. What is lost
white college-educated women are who won the 2018 election for the Democrats also.
Exactly. So to bring it all the way back, suburban white college-educated women flipped California 25 in 2018.
Yeah.
But they didn't show up in 2020. Mm-hmm. So let's get a VP candidate that will get that specific group of voters to show up.
Yeah.
Counterpoint.
Let's be more specific here. Suburban white Midwestern college-educated women.
Even more specific, yeah.
So also another thing about Pennsylvania, not a single poll has ever showed Trump in the lead, including Fox News polls.
Yes.
In Pennsylvania, there was a tie in Morning Call about 3 months ago now. But every poll in the meantime has shown Biden on top,
There
about
have been,
by consistently 6 points. By
yes,
consistently 6 points.
there have been fluctuations, but for Pennsylvania, it's the polls have shown it's
Because
relatively
the
Biden.
thing is, typically Scranton is a leaning red area, a pretty solid red city at that. But once Biden starts running, Biden's hometown is Scranton. People love Biden in Scranton, and all of northeastern PA goes super blue, just like we saw in 2008 and
And
2012.
that's why Obama got Biden on the ticket in the first place.
Exactly.
So here's my counterpoint to white Midwestern college educated women.
Mhm.
That could work, and I can see that as a strategy working. I am kind of left with a little bit of misplaced enthusiasm because of what this means for the African American vote. Sure, Biden turned out a historic amount of African American, of not just African American voters, but voters in South Carolina, the vast majority of which are African American. And so that was initially when we did the episode talking about Biden as the presumptive nominee, that is the metric that we were going off of, the fact that Biden turned out just as many voters in South Carolina to a Democratic primary as Obama did in both,
Yeah,
well,
it's also
almost as
important to
many.
mention that almost every single poll leading up to Super Tuesday before the great drop off of candidates, even like earlier on, basically the entire time, Biden has held a plurality of the African American support within the DNC.
Yes,
The question is not support. It's likely that a majority of African American voters will continue to support Biden. It's a question of turnout, though, and will they
it's
get
turnout
excited about
and it's
and
enthusiasm.
Biden?
And Biden has been doing, I'll say it. Biden has kind of been stringing Stacey Abrams along for the past month. So Stacey Abrams has come out and said she would like to be Joe Biden's VP. She
Mhm.
actually came out and said it, and has been saying it a lot as she does kind of. She goes from talk show, giving like spiels and stuff. She even did a virtual town hall with Biden. It was
Yeah.
a CNN town hall or something like that. I really, really don't like the optics of Biden kind of stringing her along like that, and I don't know how well that is going to. I don't. Now, it certainly won't matter with older African American voters. It won't matter there. But again, the difference between 98% and 92% is what we're working with here,
Mhm.
because 98% a 98% turnout or 98% like rate of voting for the Democrat among African American women
Mhm.
is how the Democrats won Alabama. So
Okay, but again, Alabama is the same thing I said with that California election. That it's a special election. You had a, you know, child predator running against overall,
sure,
both candidates were not ideal. One was obviously not a bad person, just not suited for the state, while the other was in a relationship with a child. But like that election, I do not think is a
sure.
proper goalpost.
What I meant is
Yeah.
it's not about getting a majority of African Americans to vote Democrat. It's about running up the score to ridiculous amounts, getting up into the 90, 95, 92, 90% margin of African Americans that turned out are voting Democrat. That's the kind of margins, that's the kind of rates that Democrats are going to
Mhm.
need if they're going to have a shot. If you know Ohio goes red, if when Indiana goes red, because let's face it, it
Yeah.
will. When Florida goes red, which I'm convinced that it will, that's the kind of support among African American voters that the Democrats are going to need. And Klobuchar's number one, her record among certain very progressive African Americans is not good. But then again, neither is Biden's.
Yeah.
And this, if now we don't know if he's going to pick Amy, we have no idea. But that combined with the leading Stacey Abrams along, I think is very bad form.
I just The problem with Stacey Abrams is that she has not been elected to anything outside of the state house. And she was in the state house for 10 years. So, it's a 1 decade political career, most notably known as losing an election. It's it's about as effective as it's about as good of a track record as Beto O'Rourke.
Yes, that's
Um,
exactly the comparison I was going to make.
so like while Stacey Abrams in terms of color and gender is very good, is not necessarily the best candidate to run. Whereas Amy Klobuchar does have a much more diverse background, and she can talk about on the trail like what she has, because Klobuchar did not focus on African American votes in the primary,
Not at
but
all.
her record in terms of like being a progressive, you know, candidate is not awful. She's definitely moderate, but like if you, she was a more moderate state attorney general than Kamala, or a more progressive state attorney general than Kamala Harris was.
Well, she
She
does
didn't
also
prosecute
have.
children for being truant. She didn't, you know, she didn't withhold evidence for people on death row. Klobuchar is a much more
She does have a case, though.
consistent candidate, and I think that, you know, her main appeal is definitely going to be those white Midwestern suburban college educated women.
Absolutely.
That's exactly who like elected Gretchen Whitmer.
Right.
And that's exactly who elected Wisconsin's Democratic governor also. Like I think that ultimately that would be a good choice, but obviously this is not final. We'll have this debate much later on, or maybe not much later on, once there actually is an official choice. But anyways, it is now 6:27 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, May the 21st. So our time's just about up for this evening.
Our intro and outro music is by Paul Abrams and Rock Solid Panda, and it's been produced by Elise Duda.
You can find a recording of our podcast on our YouTube channel, Catch 52, as well as Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Play Music, iTunes Music, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, you'll find us. You can also make sure to check us out on all our social medias, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Stay updated on air times, episode topics, clips, and any upcoming guests you might be having.
We welcome your comments, your feedback, your suggestions, and as always, have a good Friday and a great weekend.